Remember when a pound of ground beef, a bag of noodles, and a can of cream soup could feed your entire family for under $2? The 1970s weren't just about disco and avocado appliances. While beef prices soared 30% during the early decade recession, American home cooks were performing quiet magic in their kitchens, turning economic uncertainty into surprisingly delicious dinners. Today, we're revisiting 25 ground beef recipes that kept families fed and satisfied when money was tight. Some you'll remember from your own table. Others might have been more popular in different regions, but all of them represent American ingenuity when budgets couldn't stretch any further. Porcupine rice bake. Let's start with porcupine rice bake, a cousin to those stovetop porcupine meatballs many families knew. This oven version took the same clever concept. Uncooked rice mixed right into ground beef, but simplified everything into a casserole that needed no babysitting while it cooked. The rice would push through the meat surface during baking, creating those characteristic little spikes that gave the dish its name. Instead of rolling individual meatballs, you press the beef and rice mixture into a casserole dish, pour tomato soup or sauce over the top, and let the oven do the work. Perfect for working mothers who were juggling more responsibilities in the 70s. That crusty, caramelized top layer that developed during the final uncovered minutes? That's what made this version special. The rice cooked slowly in the beefy, tomatoey liquid while you handled homework help or folded laundry. Serve it with iceberg lettuce salad and maybe some garlic bread, and you had a meal that looked like you'd spent hours in the kitchen. Meatloaf Muffins. Someone brilliant realized that traditional meatloaf took over an hour to bake, but muffin-sized portions would be done in 25 minutes. For families racing between activities, this was genius. The mixture stayed simple: ground beef, breadcrumbs soaked in milk, egg, diced onions, and enough ketchup to add sweetness. But scooping it into muffin tins instead of loaf pan changed everything. Each muffin developed a caramelized crust all the way around, unlike regular meatloaf that only got crusty on the edges. Kids loved having their own personal-sized dinner. Mothers appreciated that extras froze beautifully for emergency meals. That glaze of ketchup and brown sugar on top would turn sticky and slightly charred, looking almost fancy when you plated them with instant mashed potatoes and green beans. The 70s didn't slow down for anyone, and neither did dinner. Beef stuffed peppers. Stuffed peppers have been around for generations, but the 70s version streamlined everything for weeknight cooking. This recipe showed up in community cookbooks from Oregon to Florida, with minor regional tweaks but the same basic idea. Bell peppers gotta have lengthwise, seeds removed, then parboiled briefly, so they'd finish cooking at the same time as the filling. The stuffing combined brown ground beef with cooked rice, minute rice for speed, canned tomato sauce, onions, and whatever seasonings your family preferred. Italian seasoning packets were popular, though some cooks just used garlic powder and oregano from the spice rack. The peppers stood upright in a baking dish with a little water in the bottom for steam, baking until tender with the filling bubbling out the top. That final touch of melted mozzarella during the last 10 minutes was absolutely mandatory. Each pepper became its own serving, making portion control automatic and presentation elegant enough for company, while staying practical enough for Tuesday night. Porcupine meatballs. These were the stovetop version that church potlucks and PDA dinners across the Midwest couldn't get enough of. The name confused newcomers until they watched white rice pushing through the meat surface during cooking, creating tiny spikes that really did look like quills. Ground beef, uncooked white rice, minced onion, and egg got rolled into golf ball-sized spheres. They nestled into thick tomato sauce, usually Campbell's condensed soup, because fresh tomatoes cost more than most budgets allowed. As everything simmered, something wonderful happened. The rice absorbed that tomatoey liquid, swelling and pushing through the meat while keeping the meatballs tender and moist. The texture landed somewhere between stuffed peppers and meatloaf, creating something entirely its own. These represented American ingenuity at its finest. Two cheap ingredients transformed into something special enough for Sunday supper, appearing in slow cookers at every community gathering. Beef and macaroni skillet. Before Hamburger Helper launched in 1971 and became a household name, home cooks were already mixing ground beef with macaroni in cast iron skillets from coast to coast. This was the original Helper, and honestly, Many families preferred their homemade version. Everything happened in one pan, which meant less cleanup for mothers working second jobs or taking night classes. Ground beef went in first, breaking into crumbles with that wooden spoon scar from years of use. Garlic powder followed. Fresh garlic still seemed exotic in most suburbs. Then came elbow macaroni, beef broth from bouillon cubes, and a generous pour of ketchup or tomato sauce. The real magic happened when the pasta cooked directly in that beefy liquid, absorbing flavor with every bubble. When the macaroni turned tender, shredded cheddar went in, melting into stringy pockets throughout the dish. Some regions added different vegetables or seasonings, but the core concept stayed the same: simple, quick, filling, and ready in 30 minutes flat. Shipwreck Casserole. This one had a polarizing reputation, but it remained popular from Texas clear up to Michigan. The name came from church cookbooks where creative titles mattered almost as much as the recipes themselves. Brown ground beef mixed with cream of mushroom or cream of chicken soup created the foundation. Then came the controversial part: an entire bag of crushed potato chips mixed throughout and piled on top. Cheese was optional but strongly encouraged, usually that pre-shredded orange kind. Those chips on top stayed crunchy and golden, while the ones mixed inside turned into salty, starchy pockets that soaked up the creamy sauce. Every bite was a texture adventure. Nutritionists definitely weren't invited to 70s potlucks, and Shipwreck Casserole proved it. This represented an era when processed foods were considered the exciting future of cooking, and people embraced them without apology. Regional variations used different soups or added vegetables, making it more of a concept than a single recipe. Hamburger gravy over mashed potatoes. This Depression-era holdover found new life when the 1970s recession hit hard. Families from Portland to Pittsburgh needed ways to make 1 pound of ground beef feed 6 people, and this delivered. The magic started in a cast iron skillet where ground beef browned and rendered its fat. Flour stirred directly into those drippings created a roux that turned golden and nutty. Milk went in slowly, transforming everything into thick, peppery gravy studded with beef. The technique varied by household. Some added onions. Others used water instead of milk, and Southern cooks might have recognized this as their version of poor man's gravy. Spooned over mountains of mashed potatoes. This wasn't fancy. It was survival that somehow tasted like love. The gravy would seep into those potatoes, creating pockets of rich, savory comfort that made you forget the electric bill was overdue. Today's restaurants charge $15 for elevated versions of this. The original never needed elevation. It had soul. Tater Tot Casserole. Here's where 1970s convenience culture reached its peak. This casserole combined 3 things Americans loved: ground beef, cream of mushroom soup, and those golden frozen potato cylinders that Ore-Ida had invented back in 1953. By the 70s, tater tots had become the crown jewel of casserole construction, especially in Minnesota, where they called this whole category hot dish. The assembly required almost no skill. Brown beef with diced onions, spread across a 9x13 pan, blanket with cream of mushroom soup straight from the can, then arrange frozen tots across the top in whatever pattern made you happy. 40 minutes at 350 degrees transformed this simple construction into something magical. The tops of those tots turned golden and crispy, while the creamy, beefy filling underneath stayed molten. Breaking through that crunchy potato crust into the savory center became a sound an entire generation remembers. This showed up at church basement funeral receptions, neighborhood potlucks, and family gatherings. Nobody called it fancy. Nobody needed to. Regional variations added cheese, vegetables, or different soups, but a basic formula stayed beloved across the country: Hamburger biscuit bake. This version layered everything into a casserole dish, where fluffy biscuits absorbed savory beef juices from below. Brown ground beef mixed with cream of mushroom soup, and maybe some frozen mixed vegetables spread across the bottom of a 9x13 pan. Then came the satisfying part: refrigerated biscuits torn into quarters and arranged across the top like a savory cobbler. Some cooks brushed the biscuit pieces with melted butter and garlic powder, small details that separated good cooks from great ones in their neighborhoods. As it baked, the biscuits puffed into golden clouds while their bottoms soaked in the creamy beef mixture. That contrast was irresistible: crispy, buttery tops with soft, gravy-soaked undersides. This was comfort food geometry, where each element enhanced the others. Different regions had their own touches, adding cheese or using different canned soups, but the basic concept of beef topped with biscuit dough appeared in cookbooks nationwide. American chop, Suey. Every Midwestern grandmother had her version of this skillet meal, though calling it goulash would make any Hungarian chef weep. In New England, they call it American chop Suey, while other regions knew it as Slumgullion or just that beef and macaroni thing Mom made. This was the one-pot wonder that saved weeknight dinners when Mom worked late at her second job. You'd start with ground beef and diced onions in a big skillet, letting everything brown until the kitchen smelled like home. Then came elbow macaroni, canned tomatoes, and whatever vegetables were wilting in the crisper. Green peppers if you had them, corn if you didn't, maybe celery if the garden was producing. Everything cooked together in one pan. The pasta soaking up those tomatoey, beefy juices. The beauty was in its flexibility. Some families topped it with cheese if payday was recent, kept it plain if money was tight. Either way, it bubbled on the stovetop, filling the house with that familiar aroma that meant dinner would be ready soon. Recipes varied wildly by household, with Italian, Polish, and Portuguese families each adding their own touches. But the concept stayed the same across the country. Beef and biscuit ring. This recipe looked impressive enough for company, but was secretly easy enough for a Tuesday, making it perfect for the aspirational 70s homemaker. Ground beef baked in the center of a refrigerated biscuit ring, emerging from the oven looking like something from a magazine spread. You brown ground beef with onions and seasonings, maybe adding corn or green beans for color, while that cooled, refrigerated biscuit dough got arranged in a circle on a baking sheet, each piece overlapping to create a connected ring. The beef mixture went into the center hollow. Then you'd fold the biscuit edges over the filling, leaving the middle exposed. 30 minutes later, you had a golden, flaky ring with savory beef peeking through. Those biscuits absorbed some of the beef juices, turning tender and flavorful. When this hit the table, guests thought you'd spend hours. The secret of that empty Pillsbury tube in the trash stayed between you and the kitchen. Different households added their own touches. Some used vegetables, others added cheese, but the basic presentation remained impressive across regions. Beef and cabbage skillet. When grocery budgets got squeezed in the mid-70s, cabbage became an unsung hero. At 15 cents per pound, this humble vegetable could transform half a pound of ground beef into dinner for 5 people. Irish and German immigrant families had brought cabbage traditions to America generations earlier, but economic necessity made it mainstream across every background. You'd brown ground beef with onions in that avocado-colored electric skillet, then add thick wedges of cabbage that would sizzle and wilt in the beef drippings. A splash of Worcestershire sauce, salt, pepper, maybe canned tomatoes if the budget allowed. The cabbage cooked down into sweet, tender ribbons that absorbed every bit of meaty flavor. It hit the table steaming hot, usually with buttered white bread for soaking up juices. Regional variations were common. Some areas added caraway seeds for a German touch. Others included potatoes to make it more filling. Nutritionists today would praise this as a vegetable-forward one-pan meal. Back then, people just called it making things work. Beef jambalaya bake. The 70s saw Americans experimenting with regional cuisines, though always filtered through a Midwestern sensibility. This dish was what happened when Louisiana's complex rice dish met suburban casserole convenience. That hours-long traditional process got streamlined into a 45-minute bake. You brown ground beef with bell peppers, onions, and celery, what Cajun cooking calls a holy trinity, though plenty of recipes suggested dried onion flakes instead of fresh. Canned tomatoes went along with white rice. Here's where the 70s really showed up. Instead of carefully made stock, most recipes call for a packet of Lipton onion soup mix. Everything went into a casserole dish with enough water to cook the rice, then baked covered until tender. The result wasn't authentic New Orleans cooking by any stretch, but it was spicy, hearty, and different enough to feel adventurous. This represented American food culture's simultaneous curiosity about regional dishes and unwillingness to abandon convenience. Some areas added more spice, others kept it mild for kids. Regional variations were common and accepted. Mock prime rib patties. When actual prime rib cost a week's grocery budget, Home cooks created recipes that captured the essence without the expense. These weren't just hamburgers. They were an attitude, a statement that your family deserved something special even when money was tight. Ground beef mixed with breadcrumbs, Worcestershire sauce, garlic powder, and liquid smoke. That bottled smoke flavor was a 70s staple, bringing campfire authenticity to suburban stovetops. The beef formed into thick patties, then got seared until crusty and brown. The finish came from a sauce made with condensed mushroom soup, thinned with red wine if you had it, or beef broth if you didn't. Presentation mattered enormously. These got plated like actual steaks, maybe with roasted potatoes and canned asparagus alongside. When you cut into them, they weren't medium rare like real prime rib, but that charred crust and savory sauce created enough theater to feel genuinely special. Different families had their own secret touches. Some added different seasonings. Others used cream of celery soup, but all versions aimed for the same goal of affordable dignity. Beef tamale pie. Despite the name, this had nothing to do with actual Mexican tamales. This was basically shepherd's pie's American cousin, made with ground beef instead of lamb, and loaded with corn, because Americans put corn in absolutely everything during the 70s. Some regions called it Mexican cornbread casserole. Others just knew it as that layered beef and potato dish. You'd brown ground beef with onions, add frozen mixed vegetables or just corn and peas, then bind everything with beef gravy made from flour, bouillon, and pan drippings. This filling went into a deep dish. Then came mashed potatoes, either leftover or instant, because nobody judged, spread thick across the top and decorated with forked tines. Those ridges would catch heat and brown beautifully. A pat of butter on top helped everything turn golden. When it emerged from the oven, that potato layer had transformed into a crust with fluffy interior protecting the bubbling, savory filling below. The whole thing fed a family of four for under $3. Regional variations added cheese, used sweet potatoes instead of white, or incorporated different vegetables based on what was available. Homemade sloppy joes. Yes, man, which existed in the 70s, but homemade sloppy joes were a point of pride for cooks who refused to surrender completely to convenience culture. This was the recipe passed down from older siblings who remembered eating these in school cafeterias, now recreated at home with more meat and significantly less mystery. The base was straightforward, brown ground beef with diced onions and green peppers until everything caramelized. Then came the sauce, and this was where personal touches mattered. Ketchup as a sweet, tangy base, brown sugar for extra sweetness, yellow mustard for tang, Worcestershire for depth, a splash of vinegar to cut richness. Some cooks added tomato paste for thickness or hot sauce for kick. The mixture simmered until it reached that consistency that was sloppy but not soupy, hence the name, spooned onto soft hamburger buns that immediately started disintegrating. These were messy by design. You needed lots of napkins. Regional variations were endless. Kansas City versions might have been sweeter, while Texas cooks added more heat. Served with potato chips and dill pickles. These brought families together without fuss or formality. Beef Enchilada Casserole. The 70s discovered Mexican food, or at least an American interpretation of it. This casserole took enchiladas apart, reassembled them in a casserole dish, and made them manageable for Tuesday night dinner. No individual rolling required, just layers that delivered similar flavors with fraction of the effort. Brown ground beef with a packet of taco seasoning. Old El Paso and Lori's were fighting for suburban pantry dominance. Canned enchilada sauce came next, mild enough that kids wouldn't protest. Then the assembly began. Corn tortillas cut into strips created layers alternating with beef mixture, refried beans, and shredded cheddar. Authentic Mexican cheeses weren't available in most supermarkets yet. The casserole baked until bubbling and golden, the tortilla strips softening into something between chips and noodles. Topped with sour cream, shredded iceberg lettuce, chopped tomatoes, and sliced black olives from a can, it looked impressive. Was it authentic Mexican cooking? Not remotely, but families loved it anyway. Different regions added their own touches. Some used flour tortillas, others added jalapenos. Representing America's growing interest in ethnic cuisines filtered through familiar formats. Beef and bean burrito bake. Following close behind enchilada casserole came this dish, another deconstructed Mexican concept made Midwest friendly. The 70s loved burritos as a concept, but rolling dozens for family dinner felt labor-intensive. This casserole delivered burrito flavors in a format that served 8 from one pan. The filling started with ground beef and taco seasoning, then added pinto or refried beans for protein in bulk. The original method involved rolling these fillings in flour tortillas and arranging them in a dish. But the lazier version, beloved by working mothers, just layered everything flat. Tortillas on bottom, beef and bean mixture, cheese, more tortillas, more filling, topped with enchilada sauce and a final blanket of cheese. The oven transformed this into a lasagna-like structure where tortillas softened into pasta-like layers. The top got slightly crispy, while everything underneath stayed tender and saucy. Regional variations were common. Southwestern cooks added green chiles, while Midwestern versions kept it milder. It appeared at potlucks and church suppers nationwide, always disappearing fast. Hamburger spoon bread casserole. Spoon bread, that southern specialty somewhere between cornbread and pudding, met ground beef in this unlikely but successful fusion. Southern cooks have been making spoon bread for generations, but pairing it with hamburger meat was pure casserole innovation that spread beyond the South during the 70s. You make a cornmeal batter with milk, eggs, butter, and baking powder, creating something pourable rather than firm. Brown ground beef mixed with sautéed onions and maybe diced green chiles went into a buttered casserole first. That cornmeal batter poured over the top, settling around the meat and creating an almost souffle-like texture as it baked. The result was spectacular. The spoon bread puffed up golden and crusty on top, while underneath the meat and cornbread melded into a spoonable mixture that was part casserole, part cornbread dressing. Southerners recognized their heritage in it, while Midwesterners embraced the familiar casserole format. Different regions added their own touches. Some included corn kernels, others added cheese, making it regional fusion before anyone called it that. Beef and hash brown casserole. Breakfast for dinner became increasingly popular during the economically strained 70s, and this casserole brought that concept to its logical conclusion. This was cowboy cooking meets suburban convenience, with ground beef replacing traditional corned beef hash and frozen hash browns replacing fresh potatoes. Speed was a selling point. The entire dish went from package to oven in under 10 minutes. Brown ground beef combined with thawed hash browns, cream of celery or mushroom soup, sour cream, and shredded cheddar. Everything mixed together in a casserole dish, then topped with crushed corn flakes mixed with melted butter for crunch. An hour in the oven transformed these humble ingredients into a golden, bubbling mass. The hash browns turned creamy inside with crispy edges. Families served this with fried eggs on top for actual breakfast-dinner fusion, or alone as a complete meal. Regional variations used different canned soups or added vegetables. It reflected the 70s breakdown of rigid food rules. If something tasted good and saved time, who cared what meal it was technically supposed to be? Sloppy Joe pie. When regular Sloppy Joes weren't fancy enough for Sunday dinner, but the budget couldn't handle a roast, creative cooks invented this hybrid. The dish took familiar sandwich-filling flavors and dressed them up with a cornbread topping that made everything feel more dinner-worthy. The base started exactly like any good Sloppy Joe, ground beef browned with onions, seasoned with ketchup, Worcestershire, and brown sugar for that sweet, tangy flavor. But instead of piling it on buns, the mixture went into a casserole dish and got topped with cornbread batter from a box mix or scratch ingredients. As it baked, the cornbread rose and turned golden while absorbing just enough beef juices to stay moist and flavorful. The result looked like a proper dinner that could grace any table, even when unexpected company showed up. Different families had their own variations. Some added vegetables to the beef mixture, others used different types of cornbread, but all versions aimed to elevate everyday ingredients into something that felt like an occasion. Ketchup-Glazed meat patties. Ketchup was more than just a condiment in 70s kitchens. It was a legitimate cooking ingredient that could transform simple ground beef into something impressive. The secret was creating a glaze that caramelized during cooking, adding both flavor and visual appeal. The patties stayed simple. Ground beef with breadcrumbs, egg, and basic seasonings formed into individual portions. But the magic came from a glaze made with ketchup, brown sugar, vinegar, and sometimes Worcestershire. This mixture got brushed over the patties before and during cooking, building up layers of sweet, tangy flavor. That glaze caramelized and created a beautiful mahogany coating that made them look expensive and sophisticated. The flavor was wonderfully complex, sweet, tangy, and savory all at once. Served with mashed potatoes and green beans, these could anchor a meal that felt special enough for Sunday dinner while staying within tight budgets. Regional variations adjusted the sweetness level or added different spices, but the ketchup-glazed concept appeared in cookbooks nationwide. Beef and sliced potato casserole. This classic layered dish reminds you of a time when cooking was all about simplicity and comfort. Layers of brown ground beef, sliced potatoes, and creamy sauce came together under a generous blanket of cheese, because more cheese always meant more love in many kitchens. The magic lay in complete simplicity, just a few staple ingredients thrown together and baked until bubbly and golden. No fuss, no complicated techniques. Plus everything cooked in one pan, which meant less cleanup. The potatoes would soften and absorb all that beefy, creamy flavor, while the cheese on top turned golden and slightly crispy at the edges. Seconds were almost always guaranteed, making this perfect for stretching grocery budgets and feeding hungry families. Regional variations were common. Some areas used cream of mushroom soup, others made a white sauce from scratch, and Midwestern cooks might have added a can of corn. This was the kind of meal that appeared on tables across America week after week, never getting old because it delivered exactly what people wanted. Salisbury Steak. Before frozen TV dinners turned this into a pale imitation, Salisbury Steak was a masterpiece of stretching meat into something genuinely special. Named after Dr. James Salisbury, this recipe became a staple because it made 1 pound of ground beef look and taste like expensive steaks for the whole family. The trick was in the binding. Breadcrumbs, egg, and a splash of milk transformed ordinary ground beef into substantial individual portions. Shaped by hand into oval patties, these got pan-fried until golden brown, then set aside while onions cooked down into sweet caramelized perfection in the same pan. The gravy built right there using beef drippings, flour for a roux, and beef broth that turned into rich brown sauce. Smart cooks made extra patties and froze them for quick meals later. Children thought they were getting actual steak for dinner, and in a way they were, just not from the butcher's expensive cuts. Regional variations added mushrooms, used different seasonings, or served it with different sides, but the basic concept of elevated ground beef appeared across the country. This was working-class steak, made with equal parts resourcefulness and care. Corn chip beef bake. This bake likely started when someone decided to use up a bag of stale corn chips instead of throwing them away. What began as a desperate measure became a family favorite, combining taco flavors with casserole comfort. Ground beef got browned and seasoned with whatever Mexican-inspired spices were available, chili powder, cumin, or a packet of taco seasoning if the budget allowed. Canned beans, corn, and diced tomatoes stretched the meat and added nutrition without much cost. The mixture went into a casserole dish and got topped with crushed corn chips and whatever cheese could be spared. As it baked, those corn chips created a crunchy topping that contrasted beautifully with the tender beef mixture underneath. The cheese melted and bubbled, creating an irresistible golden layer. Served with a simple salad of iceberg lettuce and tomatoes, it felt festive even when there was little to celebrate. Regional variations used different chips or added toppings like sour cream and olives. It proved that sometimes the best kitchen innovations come from making do with what you have. These recipes represent more than just dinners from the 1970s. They represent American resilience, creativity, and the determination to keep families fed and happy regardless of economic circumstances. These dishes came from an era when convenience products were celebrated, when casseroles were dinner sophistication, and when making something delicious from almost nothing was a point of genuine pride. Now, these recipes vary tremendously by region and household. Your grandmother's version probably differed from your neighbor's, and that's exactly how it should be. Some of these dishes were known by different names in different parts of the country, prepared with local touches that made them special to each family. Which of these classic recipes do you remember eating at your family table? Which ones bring back the strongest memories? Drop a comment and share your stories. We'd love to hear which regional variations or family touches made these dishes special in your home. If you enjoyed this journey through culinary history, hit that subscribe button. We've got decades of classic food still waiting to be rediscovered, and we'd love to have you join us for the next trip down memory lane.